Welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. And today's topic is the second half of our lecture on the Protestant Reformation. Go back up here. Now, we left off last time. We were talking about the kind of foundation of the Protestant Reformation, which is, of course, Luther and the issues of the Catholic Church. But immediately after kind of the Confessions of Augsburg, the kind of doctrinization of what it means to be a Protestant, now we have the issue over the political battle. Because is this even going to be considered a legitimate religion? Is it separate? Is it just an offshoot of Catholicism? What is this? Excuse me. And what we find here is, especially in the north, many of these German states, remember, Germany is very fragmented. And in the north, many of the German states will turn to Lutheranism. Now, is it because all these princes suddenly had, whoa, Luther, fantastic. You know what? You said exactly what I've been thinking all these years. Thank you. No. Most often it was politically motivated because now they can escape the authority of the Catholic Church. Because in addition, the Catholic Church had all these church lands in their territories that the church owned, not them. And so once you're able to escape the authority of the Catholic Church, you can confiscate those church lands for the state benefit. So, hey, you get more land for the state. Fantastic. On the other hand, the southern part of Germany remains largely Catholic under the Habsburg control. Denmark and Sweden will become Lutheran as well. But for the most part, Lutheranism did not spread far beyond northern Germany and Scandinavia. So again, those areas will turn, but for the most part, it's fairly isolated for now. Don't worry, it's going to spread. Now, enter Charles V, Habsburg dynasty, trying to maintain control of Catholicism. Emperor Charles V is going to try all he can to stop Protestantism and preserve the hegemony of Catholicism. In a sense, Charles acts as if he was a medieval emperor, trying to maintain religious unity in Europe. But by 1520s, he is allied with the Pope in trying to stamp out heresy. And in 1521, yeah, that chin. In 1521, he issues what was called the Diet of Worms. This is a tribunal of the Holy Roman Empire that is designed to outlaw and sentence execution through stake burning. And what is the number one form of heresy? Protestantism. Charles V promised before his election as the Holy Roman Emperor that he would not allow anyone in his empire to be excommunicated unless they had a fair trial. So, what does Charles V do? He demands Martin Luther recant his writings. Luther refused, saying, quote, "Here I stand, I can do no other," unquote. And so eventually, he will issue what is known as the Edict of Worms. In the Edict of Worms, again, he does so because, again, he's put on trial. Luther is. He refuses to recant. And so, in the Edict of Worms, Luther is outlawed as a heretic by the Holy Roman Empire. Now, to escape being burned, Luther was kidnapped by agents of Frederick III and taken to Frederick III's castle, where he'll be living under basically house confinement, but be allowed to be protected and continue to write and develop his theology. And sure enough, just 2 years later, in 1523, Luther will translate the Bible into the vernacular, German language, which will profoundly influence the development of the modern German language. Because people say, "Oh, I can understand this language." More people became literate as a result. And it sought to democratize the religion. Because any literate German, which is a big if, now had access to the scripture to read for themselves. So why, you might ask, why doesn't Charles V take an army, invade the castle of Frederick III, and go kill Martin Luther and stamp out this heresy? Well, the reality is Charles V had his attention diverted because he was preoccupied with a Turkish threat in Hungary, as well as his dynastic struggle with Francois I of France. And thus, Charles was never able to solely focus his military on Germany, just at the same time that the Protestantism was spreading. So, what should have happened as the defender of the faith, Charles V, what should have happened was he should have sent his army into northern Germany, taken Luther, killed Luther, and basically used his army to reinforce Catholicism, force all these northern princes to be subject to the Pope once again. But he's facing two major issues. The first one being there's a Turkish threat in Hungary, which is threatening Catholicism there because Turkish were Ottoman, they were Muslim. And second, he's dealing with a dynastic struggle with Francois I of France. So because of this, he can't focus his attention or his army solely on Germany, and thus Protestantism is allowed to spread in advance. Now, as all this is happening, we have a secondary problem going on in Germany known as the German Peasants' War. And the Peasants' War, you see the dates there. Peasants demanded, through what's called the 12 Articles in 1525, they issue what's called the 12 Articles. Again, notice the contrary, the 95 Theses done with the 12 Articles. Like, these peasants are seeing what Luther has done. They're taking their cue from Martin Luther, saying, wow, we can protest too. And they begin to demand an end to serfdom. They demand an end to the tithes. They demand the end to other feudalistic practices that oppressed and opposed the peasantry, like hunting rights. I mean, they weren't allowed to go hunting because they were peasants, because they weren't rich enough. And these peasants are being inspired to stand up to the authority, the corrupt authority, just like Luther did the Catholic Church. And of course, they're going to be met with swift oppression, because as many as 100,000 peasants are going to be killed during this uprising. And again, you see the woodcut here, Swiss peasants hanging. The interesting thing here is that while Luther does advocate for religious reform, he believed, however, that this peasant uprising was actually wrong. Even though they took their cues from Luther and were inspired by Luther, Luther himself kind of condemned the movement because he argued that people should obey their political authorities. You might ask, wait, what? Why didn't you obey the Pope then? Because Luther saw this in two different ways. He saw the issue of the Pope issue in religion as being a spiritual issue, not of this world, it's a heavenly issue. However, that was God's realm. However, the worldly realm that we live in is run and ruled by men, and therefore you should obey those men. And so, again, right or wrong, this is Luther's belief. So he kind of condemned this viewpoint. So again, while he advocates for religious freedom, he's not so progressive when it comes to, this peasant uprising. Nonetheless, both Catholic and Lutheran forces will join together, and they will suppress and squash the revolt, and nearly 100,000 people will die. Now, there's a brewing problem in Germany because of this struggle over religion. We are being threatened with another war of religion here, and threatening to break Germany apart. It's already fragmented, but make it even worse. And so in 1555, there is issued what's known as the Peace of Augsburg. And basically, this was a temporary end to the struggle of Protestant versus Catholic in Germany. So Lutheranism versus Catholicism in Germany is being settled temporarily, peace, just temporarily. And it was the Peace of Augsburg. But basically, it said very simply, you see the Latin version there, whoever reigns, his religion. In other words, whoever the local ruler is in the very fragmented city-state type place of Germany, the local ruler will determine Catholic or Protestant. Simple as that. And If you were a Protestant who was living in Catholic areas, you were allowed to move to Protestant states. And if you were a Catholic living in a Protestant state, you could move to a Catholic place. So you can go live wherever you want. And the result of this is, one, yes, there's some peace. We'll stave off some religious wars for a while. But it will result in a permanent religious division in Germany that essentially reaffirms the independence of these various city-states, which will prevent German nationalism, which will prevent the unification of Germany up until 1871. So this is going to cause another 300 years of political fragmentation, lack of unification, lack of nationalism in Germany. But it does prevent bloodshed. So yay, at least for a while. Don't worry, we'll come back to that later. So here's what it looks like now. So northern Germany, mostly Protestant. Southern Germany, mostly Catholic. Let's talk about the end here. How does it spread? Well, as you know, when you allow people to read the Bible for themselves, it's going to cause different interpretations. I mean, this should make sense to you. Because I give you an assignment often to read primary sources. And I make you do a discussion board or have a discussion over them. And I expect you will each who read it will have a different interpretation of it. That's the beauty of scholarly activities. The problem is when you do that with the Bible, it causes more and more fragmentation. So we went from having one universal religion, Catholicism, to now two. You have Catholicism and Lutheranism. But then, as more people read the Bible, we start seeing a number of new, quote-unquote, I'll call them denominations, that fall under the umbrella of Protestantism begin to arise. So we see the spread of Protestantism, and as it does, it creates new denominations besides just Lutheranism. You get groups like the Anabaptist. Yeah, the fear of every monopoly. Diverse opinions. So Anabaptists. Now, Anabaptists were formed in 1525 in Zurich, Switzerland. Now, theoretically, they were a voluntary association of believers with no connection or allegiance to any state. Again, they want to be apolitical. They reject secular agreements. They refuse to take civil oaths, pay taxes, hold public offices, or serve in the military. Wow. Let me repeat that. No civil oaths. So you will never swear allegiance to the king. You will not pay taxes. You will not hold public office. You will not serve in the military. Do you see why this is a problem for rulers, princes, and kings? These people are not loyal to you. They're not paying taxes. They don't serve in the military. You're in trouble if you're an Anabaptist. Now, as far as their religious beliefs, how they're a little different from, say, Luther himself. They believe that childhood baptism is stupid. Basically, I'm putting it in very vernacular terms. Because the idea of baptism in the Bible, as John the Baptist did it, including baptized Jesus himself, was that an adult makes a decision to get baptized and commit their life to God, right? So why then would you baptize a baby who has no decision making here? You're just doing it for them? Now, churches that believe in infant baptism say, well, because the baby is born as a sin nature, it's called original sin. Every person is evil, and therefore we're baptizing the baby to get them to heaven. If by some chance the baby dies before they come of age to make their own decision. That's the argument. But they say, no. Only adults can make the decision to commit to Christ and become baptized. So Anabaptist. They also believe that they were known as Malarians, which means that the end of the world is near. They also reject the idea of the Trinity, the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. There's only one God. And essentially what you would say then, in many respects, is many historians claim, that Anabaptists are known as the kind of the far left wing of Protestant Reformation. Because they're kind of out there in the far left radical. They reject a lot of things. Now, in 1532, though, you see the picture here on your screen, a radical group of revolutionary Anabaptists will actually take control of the northwestern German city of Munster. Led by John of Leyden, He will take over, become the leader of Munster. He will institute polygamy. He himself had 16 wives. All books except the Bible were burned. And they begin killing Lutherans and Catholics. Now, just 2 years later, in 1534, after 2 years of this crap, there was known as the tragedy at Munster, which you see pictured, as both the Protestant armed combined forces of Protestants and Catholic forces will capture the city and execute the Anabaptist leaders. So Anabaptists, there's still some in existence, but they are relatively short-lived. But what does come out of this group, again, the less radical part of it, is you start seeing a number of new denominations that I believe many of you have heard of. Number one, the Mennonites. They were founded by a Dutch leader, Menno Simons, and they were descendants of the Anabaptists. And of course, Mennonites are the ones who, while they'll embrace some technology, they largely live like an Amish person. They don't believe in living within the world. They have separate communes most often. Then you have the second group that were directly descended from Anabaptists, the Quakers. And of course, Quakers, much like the Mennonites, will emphasize pacifism. They'll be pacifists. And Quakers, of course, will be in England, and they will share similar belief. And of course, thousands are going to come to the Americas, specifically thanks to, of course, our good friend, William Penn, and form Pennsylvania, also in New Jersey and Delaware. And then the third group is the Unitarians. The Unitarians also reject the Trinity and will be heavily influenced by the Anabaptists. A second group that kind of springs off from this is in Switzerland. There is Ulrich Zwingli, and this is a Swiss Reformation of their version of the Catholic Church. He will adopt Lutheranism, and he will be a student of humanism who preached Erasmus' edition of the New Greek Testament. Now, in contrast to Luther, he saw the Eucharist as only symbolic, whereas he thought that Luther's idea that the real presence of God was there was too Catholic. So remember, transubstantiation said that literal transformation of blood and bread into body and wine, or body and blood. Luther said, no, it's the real presence of God that's just there, not literal transformation. Zwingli says, yeah, it's too Catholic for me. And says, no, it's just symbolic. Like, we're just taking this as a symbol of what happened, which is what most mainstream Protestant denominations believe nowadays. He also became the first major dispute, though, among Protestants dealing with the issue of doctrine. And ultimately, Zwingli will officially split with Luther over this issue of the Eucharist. Next on the list is John Calvin. Now, of course, John Calvin becomes very important because, well, you'll find out in a minute, and you should remember from last year you had U.S. history. Now, John Calvin was a Frenchman who studied to be a priest and later became a lawyer. He was especially influenced by humanism and, most specifically, Erasmus, who will be exiled to Switzerland for his reform ideas. Now, in 1536, he will publish what he called the Institutes of Christian Religion. And this becomes the foundational work for Calvinists. Now, Calvinism is still a prevalent religion in mainstream America today. Even though most don't like have a church that says Calvin, but they're not Calvinist. But yet, Calvinist ideas are everywhere. There are a number of Calvinist universities even. So what do they believe? Well, they believe in the concept known as predestination. And so they said, you're predestined. Your destiny, heaven or hell, is predestined by God. And the argument is because God is omniscient, right? He's all-knowing. He already knows who's going to heaven and who's destined for hell. And thus, good works are never going to be sufficient for salvation. But on the other hand, he also argues there's no free will because God has already made his decision. And this is where you get into the muck of theology. Because you could argue, well, no. Maybe it's just God's all-knowing. He already knows what's going to happen, but you can still choose. But yet, so maybe you have free will, you can choose, but God already knows what you're going to decide. Or you take the idea of predestination with John Calvin, and he says, no. God's already made his decision because he's all-knowing, he knows what's best. and we have no idea. We should just go about life and do good things, but understand that at the end, it's all in God's hands. Again, this is a very tricky issue, even with modern day democracies, right? Because in the old days, the Bible said, well, God puts rulers in authority. How does that work in democracy when people vote? God is not appointing the person. This is not a mandate of heaven idea. This is not being, knighted upon by the Pope himself as authoritative that you have the power to rule, that God chose you. That worked out well when you have a Roman emperor or Chinese emperor or king. That made sense. But how does that work in modern day republics and democracies? Do we not have free will to choose who we vote for? I mean, will we not decide in 2020 whether you vote for Donald Trump or Joe Biden? Or does our vote really not matter because God's already predestined it? Again, that becomes a theological debate. And so anyway, he says predestination, you're already predestined. However, good works do you no good to get to heaven, but you should do good works as a sign that you have been chosen for salvation. So those who God has predestined will do good works because you are, naturally going to do good works to go to heaven because you're a good person. And he also did say that God will reveal if a person's been chosen for salvation through a conversion experience. In other words, you'll kind of get that feeling inside. I've had that, the light has been shown. And the elect are church members who've had that conversion experience. And they should become model Christians, visible saints. They should be the city on a hill that all people look to for how to live properly. Now, officially, Calvin establishes a theocracy in Geneva by 1540, and Geneva becomes the new center of Reformation in Europe. Geneva will become home to many Protestant exiles throughout England, Scotland, and France, who will later then return to their home countries with these Calvinist ideas. Only those who committed to following Calvinism were allowed to live in the city of Geneva. If that sounds familiar, it should. Because, this is 1540. By 1620, 1630, you have Puritans from England, Calvinists, who will sail across the ocean blue, settle in Plymouth Rock, set up the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and established what John Winthrop called a city on a hill. Now, Calvinism becomes the most militant and uncompromising of all religious sects. Massachusetts, Anne Hutchinson, Salem witch trials. So, for instance, what I mean by other things, though, are activities such as drinking, singing secular music, dancing, usury, which usury means lending money at more than 5% interest, and gambling are expressly prohibited. So again, very strict rules. And he developed what became known as the Protestant work ethic. In other words, Calvinists emphasized later that the importance of hard work and accompanying financial success are a sign that God is pleased. This is not a poverty-induced religion. And again, this should make sense for you to have the U.S. history last year. That the Protestant work ethic says you should work hard to make money to show that you're approved by God. And you remember last year, New England, the carrying trade, independent competency. Ring a bell? I hope so. Now, as Calvinism spreads, it begins to also splinter and becomes a number of different denominations spread from that, including one my dad grew up in, which is Presbyterianism. And now Presbyterianism was established by John Knox in Scotland. So John Knox was someone who traveled to Geneva, took it back home, and began to implement it in his own way. So not all the tenets of Calvinism made it through. And so the idea that the presbyters govern the church, so there was a layer of authority. And this became the dominant religion in Scotland. And again, they'll largely reject some things like predestination, like they just kind of believe that you should come and do good works. And you should have a faith in God. Now, of course, in France, the group will be known as the Huguenots. They will be the French Calvinists who will be brutally suppressed in France. but they are especially strong among the nobility, though they will see converts from every social class. Then, of course, in the Netherlands, the Dutch will form the Dutch Reformed Church. The rise of Calvinism there will dominate religion and stage a revolt against the Inquisition of King Philip II. By 1581, Netherlands will declare its own independence from Spain, and eventually will, as you saw in the Age of Exploration, be able to show that they are their own independent country. And then finally, of course, the Puritans in England that we talked about last year in U.S. history. So as we see, Protestantism spreads drastically throughout Europe in this period, after the Protestant Reformation of Martin Luther and through the teachings, of course, of John Calvin. Next time we'll come back and see the rest of this, including how does the Catholic Church respond. So until next time, take care. Bye-bye.